My name's Eliz Barrett Milner, and I've done a series of paintings, and I've named them Rare. There's 24 of them. I started out with the passenger pigeon, thinking of how they are long gone. And there's a lot of things that are passing through this life, not to mention ourselves, but may as well give them a nod. This is a view actually from the sandal maker. I see it quite often, not always with these characters in it, but the mastodon, his tusks are way up. He's mad. And it's just about some of the books that I read, Last of the Curlews by Fred Bosworth and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And at times I'll see the Caspian tern, which really only arrived in Port Dover maybe in the last 7 years, at least where I see them, and they make the worst squawk, and the tourists don't seem to notice, but it's hilarious. And at times there's martins or a large weasel that comes up out of the cracks of the East Pier. I often look at the water and really study, what color is it, and it was that color that day. This painting is called The Mixed Farm with Wyandottes, and mixed farms aren't money makers, so there aren't as many around anymore. But this is one that I visited with my father in the mid-50s. Early 60s. It was at the end of Tisdale Road, and he was actually delivering some milk and bread to this family. And in the yard was a tom turkey that I saw for the first time really display, and he was very colorful. The Holstein cow, there's plenty of them still. He's just grazing, but the Wyandotte chickens were developed right here in Port Dover by John S. Martin, who was the Minister of Agriculture for Canada at one time, and the white Wyandotte especially. Now there's all different colors of Wyandottes, but they're called the birds with curves. They're beautiful shapes. So there's a flock there, and these posts are cement or concrete, and they were made locally by someone. I just can't recall his name, but I've always liked them, and there's some on a lot of the farms in Norfolk County and Woodhouse Township. This painting is actually very close to home. The Clonmel is at the top, the Barrett Estate house and the Ivy house at the bottom, the Ivy's Dam, and the Parkinson's house here is one of the older homes in the area in Prospect Hill. This house was actually brought in, but it is an old home, just moved here. It's morning, and it's quite a busy little corner. Quite often you do see deer passing through and wild turkeys. And actually John S. Martin lived up here in one of the big brick homes, and that's where the Wyandotte was begun in Canada. Okay, this one's called A Powerful Bird Walked Freely One Day. It's one of the first ones in this series of Rare. I read about the great bustard, who actually is not a Canadian bird, but he's a threatened bird and just a strong little bird, and I wish he was here. The hedgerows in this area take a beating at times, but they're very important to have because the birds, the deer, any wildlife can hide out after they've traveled across a field. So I've represented some of our trees, and there's one of those posts again that I really like. This is one of the first paintings in this series of rare. The bear is definitely not in this area anymore. The deer are plentiful and the swan, but there's still the threat. So if you turn this painting on its side, the deer is actually hanging. It's been shot by one leg. The bear, his hind legs are tied together, and this swan, if you look, that's a very dead looking eye. Okay, this one's called Pitcher Plant with Turkeys. The wild turkey was reintroduced here probably over 10 years ago, and when you're driving out towards Long Point you can see them in the fields. The swan, of course, the tundra swan travels through here different times, and this is the pitcher plant. The bear I discovered in part of my Aunt Barbara Brown's collection of folk art, and of course they were here at one time. And the passenger pigeon wasn't eaten by a bear, but he's just flying through, and this is the end of Long Point. This is the deer and the bear and the swan over Long Point again, with ice flows and the tip of the point. It's similar to another painting I did, but I wasn't quite finished with those three, so this is another attempt. This is called The Beaver and the Dove. There was a beaver that lived up Black Creek, and I was kayaking one day with a friend and discovered him. He was huge and living quite happily up there. And time went by, a summer at Bridge Street and Coleman's Point and boating and in Port Dover. Wonderful times you can have here. And by the end of the season I'd heard that the beaver had been shot, probably obstructing the creek too much, but he was an impressive animal. This was called The Bear, the Owl, and the Jackrabbits. I did begin to call it the threat of extinction. It looks as if the bear and the owl are actually talking about it. This is the end of Long Point again, and the jackrabbits, I haven't read that they're disappearing, but I don't see them as much as I used to. And I often think of the animals that do cross the lake in the winter if we have a lot of ice, and cougars have come across from New York State, and the rabbits can get across pretty quickly. This painting is called Pickerel in the Trees. At first you're not aware that there is a fish right behind the deer's head. My sister-in-law, Jean McVeigh, wrote a poem about we'll see pickerel in the trees when this happens. I've placed the bear at Long Point again, and the swan is looking at the bear, and so is the deer. And of course the shipping lanes are still open. This is the Inuit hunter and the Chesapeake retriever. It takes place at Long Point again. The Marburg mastodon is up in the right-hand corner. Polar bears have been on my mind lately, that the ice is melting and they're drowning. And actually the bear is taken from our quarter, and the caribou is taken from the quarter. The toonie has the bear on it, and Abigail Becker saved a lot of lives at the end of Long Point. And she's a powerful person, as well as this extra large dog that lived at the point at one time. And the Inuit hunter is holding up 10 fingers because he's found a 10-point caribou or reindeer. And I just like bringing the North and South together. It's just as important what happens up there as down here. This painting's called One Turtle Dove, and I came across this image from Nature Canada magazine, stating how the turtle doves are actually being shot as they travel, as they migrate in Europe. And it made me think of Christmas. I was working at the time on this painting. It was Christmas time, and so we're having dinner at my grandmother's, and there's one turtle dove. This one's called a Log's Journey. I've painted this area a fair bit around Normandale. The tree represents the largest tulip tree in Ontario. I say it's the largest one in the universe, and it's right at the top of the hill, and Normandale is down in here. And there's a cemetery across from the tulip tree. And there is a story of a pioneer that was actually buried in a log, and so that was in my mind as I painted this. It's traveling along just like the shipping lanes, and this owl has appeared in a few other paintings that I've done. They're always on the watch. Okay, this is another painting of Port Ryerson with bluebirds flying over. That's very close to horse country. There's a lot of horses live in Norfolk County, more than you'd realize, thousands of them. And the Anglican Church, and the fishermen again. Bill Calder made these little blocks to help people know where to park when they go to the church, and I just love them. And it's the bluebirds are plentiful at times, especially out there. I've seen them several times over the Ryerson farm. Okay, this one's called Port Ryerson with windmills. Port Ryerson is a beautiful little spot that sometimes it hits me in different ways, and I've done a few paintings of this view. Of course, the church is central, and some of the cottages. One day there were some young men fishing with hip waders on in the winter. There's horses in the area, and historic homes. It's got a lot going on, and of course the dove is flying over. This is called The Wedding. I came across a story at my father's house that actually my grandfather Russell Brown wrote for the Simcoe Reformer, I think 70 years ago, about a young couple coming from Port Rowan by oxen to be married at the St. John's Church. And they couldn't be married in the church because they actually couldn't get there with their oxen, so they were married in the stable. And so I brought the animals in. The Marburg Mastodon attended the wedding. The sheep, the oxen really are turning into shorthorn cattle, and the horse is resting, but he's very interested in what's going on. And the bride and groom are upside down, and which seemed natural to me. The church is a beautiful church. Of course, the one that they would have been married in had burnt down. So this is the one that's standing today. And I find arrowheads off and on, and broken glass, and the dove is present again. This is a view of Blythe Bray Farm, which exists in Simcoe, was Monroe Landon's farm. I'm friends with some of the members of the family, and they showed me this photograph, which was taken from the top of the house, which is a very beautiful older home. And we talked about their uncle, who actually had a white peacock that roamed around, and Monroe Landon had seen a passenger pigeon in his laneway, and then my dad mentioned that he had one of the best Jersey cattle herds. So I've added the Jersey cow. This is the bear again at Long Point. Really angry about extinction. I guess he's my symbol of anger. And the Blandings turtle, which is the sweetest little turtle that you rarely see. It might be right along the shoreline, and they're just not seen as much as they used to be, and apparently they're endangered. This is Port Dover scene, and the swan that came to Port Dover and decided to stay in the creek. The harbor entrance and the bridge. This is actually the old bridge. This doesn't exist anymore, this area, but the smaller boats would go through here, and they didn't have to lift the bridge. The fish is sideways, maybe eventually turning upside down. I'm not sure what kind he is, but the fish are in trouble too. And this is a fishery, and of course the early museum before the addition. This is a view of Victoria, and some of the thoughts that enter my mind when I go through this little town. James Kadalka, a very famous person, choreographer, lives here, and he'd been working on a routine for about Johnny Cash. The Colonel Peanuts elephant, I allowed him to escape and run to town. A good friend of my family, Michael Bradstreet, was always studying polar bears, so this is his home and a polar bear outside the house. Just some of the important buildings. There was a story of this house. A woman that lived there had a thumb screw, which is a form of torture that they used around the War of 1812. So I always remembered that. And there was a big swan in the conservation area that was very friendly. Well, Thomas Bowlby, a relative of mine, actually staved off one of the attacks in 1812 by the Americans by riding a white horse and allowing it to rear up on the cliffs, and then moving on down with his uniform on and rearing again and on down, and the Americans thought there was a whole army there, but it was just one man. And of course, Long Point rules. This is passenger pigeons over Victoria, along with a deer. The Long Point, you can see, is off to the left, and the plowed fields, and the wooden Anglican church that's painted so it doesn't look like it's made of wood, but it is. Victoria's really early settlement here, and passenger pigeons were plentiful. This is the last painting in the series, and it's dealing with the last fishery that I know of in Port Dover. I see this fish shanty practically every day. It's right in the harbor, and I like to bring the cross that's on Brant Hill down so people can see it. So I brought it in closer, and there is a swan that has arrived in Port Dover and stays in the creek most of the winter. But the fellow that fished there had a tilbury, and he had a license to fish in just 1 mile out from the beach, and he rowed out as a rule. He had an engine, but he rowed out and brought, sometimes picked up some rocks to bring back to shore up his building, and he worked very hard, and that was the end of that way of life.